So I'm delighted to be here. I want to say thank you to the organisers for inviting me to share some of the work that I've been doing with some other people over the last, actually it's now 5 years, unbelievably. And I'll explain a little bit about why that's taken us so long to do. So my name is Sandra Eldridge. I'm Director of the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Unit at Queen Mary in London. And I also run the Centre for Primary Care and Public Health, which is in this lovely old building that you can see here reflected in another part of the university. So the background to this work is that probably most people in the room know that there are a large number, if you look in the literature, of studies called feasibility and pilot studies. However, those terms, pilot and feasibility, are not used consistently. There is evidence that these types of studies are poorly conducted, and I'm sure everybody has got anecdotal evidence also about the difficulty of getting these types of studies into the published domain. This is the team. So Christine Bond approached me in 2011, just after we had run a very successful workshop at the Society for Academic Primary Care conference in Bristol, and she said we really should do something on pilot and feasibility studies. It wasn't my intention. A lot of the stuff that I've done in my academic life have seemed to have been slightly by accident. This one certainly was. Great, thank you very much. So we got together a small team and we started to work on this. I don't think any of us thought it would take us 5 years to get where we've got now. But also I have to mention that along the way we had a great expert consensus panel who supported us in this work. So our aim when we started this was to concentrate really on work prior to randomised controlled trials. There's lots of things called pilot feasibility studies out there that are not in preparation for randomised controlled trials. But we wanted to concentrate on randomised controlled trials. And initially, the only thing we wanted to do was to provide reporting guidelines for pilot and feasibility studies, and we decided to use 2 checklists. I'll explain why in a moment. But eventually, what we ended up doing was to provide 1 reporting checklist for pilot trials and a conceptual framework for pilot and feasibility studies. Now, the reason we did that was when we started, we based this idea of doing 2 checklists, one for pilot studies and one for feasibility studies, on the UK National Institute for Health Research definitions of these things, and they have mutually exclusive definitions. But over the period that we were doing this work, we gradually, as we presented the work amongst the research community, realised there were conflicting ideas amongst the funders, amongst the literature, and amongst the research community. And so we felt we had to do a little bit more on a conceptual framework for pilot feasibility studies. So to give you some examples of some of those conflicts, looking in the literature, there are 2 classic papers, one by Arain and one by Thabane. There's another one by Jill Lancaster, which many of you may know, published in 2004. But certainly the 2 papers that I've got up there on the screen have a slightly different view about pilot feasibility studies, with the Arain paper saying they have slightly different characteristics, and the Thabane paper saying a pilot study is synonymous with a feasibility study. Then when we began to look at what the funders said, the NIHR are, or were at that time, the only funding body that we could find with a very clear definition, and they have this very clear idea, as I've said, that feasibility and pilot studies are mutually exclusive. But they also say pilot studies are a smaller scale version of the main study. But if you look at the bottom there, the UK Medical Research Council, they specifically say a pilot study need not be a scale model of the planned main stage evaluation. And in fact, they put pilot studies and all other types of feasibility studies under one umbrella and don't really make a distinction between them. So when we started to do the work of developing some reporting guidelines, we did a very, very small sort of pre-pilot study, and this is some of the quotes that came out of that. Somebody said, well, my study was both feasibility and a pilot study, so what do I do with that? And then people had very clear views, and some people have very strong views about the definitions. Somebody said, well, nobody uses the definitions, so it doesn't matter how you define them. And the other said, the funders are a bit like God. You can't change them. They've got the definitions there. You can't alter them. So as we began to talk to more and more people, we found more conflicting views about this. So we went back to the dictionary. And if you look at dictionary definitions of pilot feasibility studies, what's very clear is what these two sorts of studies are for. Both pilot and feasibility studies have this idea of, should we go ahead with something? Will this idea work, and should we proceed with it? And that as a sort of aim of pilot or feasibility studies is quite clear. Pilot studies then have this sort of additional element, if you look in the dictionary, that they are some kind of small-scale experiment in advance of a main experiment. So, armed with all those ideas, we developed a conceptual framework for pilot and feasibility studies. And we defined, first of all, a feasibility study as a study that asks whether something can be done, should we proceed with it, and if so, how. So that's taken more or less directly from something on the previous slide. And that's something in the context of doing something before a randomised controlled trial. That something could be a randomised controlled trial, or it could be an intervention that you're trying to develop. So then we said, well, a pilot study asks exactly the same question. So there's no difference between what the two things are aiming to do. But a pilot study also has a specific design feature. In a pilot study, the future study, whatever it is, or part of that future study, is conducted on a smaller scale. And so the corollary of this is that all pilot studies are feasibility studies, but not all feasibility studies are pilot studies. And if you prefer pictures, it's a bit like that. So that's a little bit different from where we started with the NHR definitions. So to give you a bit of an example, these are examples that we use frequently, nice examples of different types then of feasibility studies. So you can see the first one, the aim of the first study is definitely to assess feasibility. This was a randomised study, and they were looking at various things in that study, recruitment, retention, etc. So it was a scale model of what they hoped the main RCT would be. So this we've referred to as a randomised pilot study. The next study, they wanted a pilot and intervention to avoid the use of syringes amongst injecting drug users. But what they did here was they just piloted the intervention. So they didn't have a control group. They weren't randomising, and they looked at the 4 components of the intervention to see how well they were adopted, and they also looked at whether there were changes in blood residues which indicated that it might be worth going on to do a main study. So that is a pilot study. They were piloting the intervention that they hope to use in the end, but it's not randomised. So we called that a non-randomised pilot study. The third example is an example of a feasibility study where they wanted, in the end, to run a trial in surgery. But the feasibility study didn't involve putting an intervention in place. It wasn't a small randomised trial or anything like that. It was just a questionnaire that they took to surgeons and patients to ask their opinion about whether, if this study went ahead, whether patients would take part, whether surgeons would take part. So that is a feasibility study, but it's not in any way a pilot study. So we developed our conceptual framework, and if you focus initially in this diagram on the blue part, around those 3 types of feasibility study. So the blue part of this diagram shows feasibility studies, and you can see there the 3 different types: the randomised pilot study at the top, the non-randomised pilot study there on the left, and other feasibility studies on the right. These 3 distinct types of feasibility study, but one of the very important bits of feedback that we got when we were developing this work from our consensus group was that very often these 3 types, or however people conceptualise them, are seen in a very linear fashion. So you start with something that we've called other feasibility study, and then you move on to your non-randomised pilot study, and then finally you do your randomised pilot study. What the consensus group said was, actually, it's not as linear as that. Sometimes you go backwards and forwards between these studies. So they wanted us to put together a framework which indicated that you can go backwards and forwards from these different types of studies. So the pink, I'm not quite sure what colour that is actually, but it's pink on my laptop. Uncertainty about feasibility is where you start. If you're uncertain about how to do something in your main study, then a feasibility study is the place to start. So you start outside in the pink bit, you go into the blue bit, you choose your most appropriate feasibility study, and you go round and round in this circle until you're clear enough about what you want to do. And then you move inwards to the orange bit, your main trial, and that may itself have an internal pilot study as part of it. What this framework does is it picks up on some of the existing ideas amongst funders. So the Medical Research Council in particular say that a pilot study need not be a scale model. We saw that quote earlier on, but it should address the main uncertainties that have been identified in the development work. And we felt that we wanted to pick up on that was something that was important. In terms of NIHR make a distinction between pilot studies, which are randomised, and non-pilot studies, or feasibility studies, as they call them, which are non-randomised. So there's a link between what the National Institute for Health Research say and what we say, but it's not exactly the same. So that is our conceptual framework. It was published in PLOS One. And if you want to read more about that and all the other things that we did in order to get to that framework, then I would suggest you read that paper. But what about conducting and reporting pilot studies? So, as I said, we started with this idea that we were going to develop reporting guidelines, and develop two. We held a number of meetings, open meetings, the expert consensus meeting. We took our work to a lot of research conferences. As a result of the feedback that we got, in the end, we decided to develop only one reporting guideline. And I'm going to say a little bit about that. But first of all, to say, even before we did this, there are recommendations in the literature about conducting pilot studies. So I would have thought that quite a lot of people will know this paper from Jill Lancaster in 2004. And these are the recommendations out of her paper. So they've been around now for 12 years or so. That pilot studies should have a well-defined set of aims and objectives. And I've just written three particular things that I want to highlight here. That the analysis of a pilot study should be mainly descriptive, or should focus on confidence intervals. And the results from hypothesis testing should be treated with caution. Recommendations from Arain, which is one of the other papers that I mentioned earlier, they concluded that pilot studies were still poorly reported, with inappropriate emphasis on hypothesis testing, and they recommend that people don't carry out hypothesis testing. And in the same year, Fabinet paper recommends that pilot studies should be designed, again, with clear objectives, and this time mentioning feasibility objectives, and that they should have also explicit criteria for determining the success of feasibility. So explicit criteria for saying whether something is feasible or not. So those recommendations are already there. And there's another paper by Shanind in 2011, which is a nice paper reviewing a large number of randomised pilot studies that shows that actually a lot of these recommendations still weren't being followed, and just emphasising the way that these things should be conducted. So putting all that stuff together, I want to really talk about four aspects of pilot feasibility studies. First of all, the objectives. Secondly, the criteria for determining feasibility. And the National Institute for Health Research, if anybody's ever put in any applications to funding for these types of studies for the National Institute for Health Research, then they do stipulate that they would like to see clear progression criteria. How are you going to decide whether you're going to progress from your feasibility or pilot study to the main study? And there's already a very nice statement here, I think, from Cindy Billingham in 2013 about all studies having a sample size justification, but that not all studies need to have a sample size calculation. And for pilot and feasibility trials, while sample size justification is important, a formal sample size calculation may not be appropriate. And I think that also sums up the feeling of our group. And then finally, that suggestion from Jill Lancaster that the analysis of a pilot study should be mainly descriptive. So what I want to go on to talk about is the objectives, those criteria for determining feasibility, and then the sample size and analysis. But just to say a little bit about the extension, because it's really in doing the work for this CONSORT extension that we've come out with the guidance that we have, and also some of the examples that I'm going to show you and some of the thinking. So in the end, we developed this CONSORT extension for randomised pilot or feasibility trials. And in order not to make the document too cumbersome, we referred to these things, we shortened that and referred to these things as pilot trials. So if you hear me using pilot trial, what I'm referring to is a randomised study. So this checklist applies to these randomised pilot trials conducted in preparation for a future definitive trial of either effectiveness or efficacy. That's one of the CONSORT principles that the trials that they are developing guidelines for can be looking at either effectiveness or efficacy. So the primary aim of these pilot trials is to determine the feasibility of the future definitive trial. But very importantly, we put no restrictions on the terminology that people use to describe the preparatory trial. And the reason for that is we didn't want people to escape from these guidelines by saying, actually, this is an exploratory trial. It's not a pilot or feasibility study, so I don't have to follow your guidelines. So we put no restrictions on the terminology. If it's a preparatory study, it's randomised, and it's in preparation for a main RCT, then it comes under these guidelines. No restrictions on the design of either trial, so they could be cluster randomised, they could be crossover, they could be a two-way factorial, there could be anything. But it doesn't apply to internal pilot studies where the situation is a little bit different. So I'm going to talk about 4 key messages that are in this CONSORT extension, but also reflect our wider thinking. So the first key message about conduct and reporting is basically this message about objectives, that the methods, the data, the analysis, and the progression criteria should all match the objectives of a pilot or feasibility trial. And that, in keeping with what the Medical Research Council of the UK say, that the objectives should be based on the uncertainty. So that's the first question to ask: what is the uncertainty, and base the objectives on that. The question is then, what sort of objectives can we have in these type of studies? And I think there's a number of ways of looking at that. What could be the main uncertainties in the future trial? Well, one way of looking at that is to think, well, what does the main CONSORT statement say you should report? So let's have a look at all the things that the main CONSORT statement says you should report, and let's see if you've got uncertainty in any of those areas. So these are the areas covered by the main CONSORT statement. So you could have uncertainty in any of these areas, and that may be an objective of your feasibility study, to iron out that uncertainty. But you can also look empirically at what people have done in some of these studies. So in 2 of the papers that I've already mentioned, they did this. They looked at a number of trials and other pilot studies, pilot trials and pilot studies, to see what people had done in the past in terms of their objectives. And you can see the list there from at the top, testing the integrity of study protocols, right down to the bottom, looking at the randomisation procedures and everything in between. So there are a number of things there that you could look at. in a very similar study, Shannon et al. In 2011 looked at a large number of randomised pilot feasibility studies, so pilot trials, the things that our CONSORT extension is designed for. And these were, again, very similar list of possible objectives that these studies had. So they were looking at the feasibility of, say, eligibility or recruitment, consent, the randomisation procedures, but also there at the top, maybe looking at trying to estimate some inputs that you might need for sample size calculations. Down at the bottom, looking at the logistics of a multi-centre trial, and right at the bottom, looking at whether all the components of the protocol would work together. So there's a number of ways of looking at this. And what Shannon et al. Go on to do is to unpack some of those possible objectives and say which of these objectives need to be done within a randomised pilot study and which could be done outside a randomised pilot study. So I'd recommend having a look at that paper for a bit more detail on that. So what we have recommended is that people should have an overall objective. The overall objective of the feasibility study should be about the feasibility of conducting the definitive trial. But within that people should actually specify very specific objectives that they have. Now, having said that, we recognise that actually one of the things about doing a pilot or feasibility study is there's often things that jump up and hit you that you just hadn't thought of as an objective, but they come out of the study anyway, and there is provision in the CONSORT guidance for people to report that. We think that they should report that if that happens. And also that a lot of these elements of pilot feasibility studies, they're integrally related, so that you might be looking at something, but actually you might find something else as you're doing it. Nevertheless, it's a good starting point to try and have some specific objectives for your pilot study. So this is an example where you can see there the main objective was to assess the feasibility of conducting a definitive trial. So very clear. One of the reasons for putting in that objective, it makes it a lot easier for people who are searching through the literature, as we were, to try and decide what people are really trying to do in their study. But then below, you'll see there are 3 separate objectives there. They wanted to establish suitable procedures for delivering the intervention. They wanted to assess the acceptability of the assessment tool, and they wanted to find out about patient experience. So within the overall objective, there were 3, actually there were more specific objectives. And then the data collection should actually match those objectives. So this is quite a nice paper where they're looking at a number of objectives. And I have highlighted on this slide the different objectives that they said they had when they outlined the objectives in the paper. And for each one of those, they actually specify how they're going to assess this particular objective. So the one I've underlined there, the practicability was considered and was assessed in terms of the percentage of users in adolescents and professionals. This trial was looking at a web-based tool. So they were going to assess in terms of its bounce percentage. I'm not quite sure what that is, but they're quite clear on how they're going to assess these objectives. So that's the first message, key message in terms of conduct and reporting. Our second key message was that a pilot trial doesn't need a formal sample size calculation to determine effectiveness. That's because the aim of this study is not to determine effectiveness. If the aim was to determine effectiveness, then you ought to power it in order to do so, and then it would become a main trial. So it's a fairly simple argument for not having a formal sample size calculation. But on the other hand, we think that people should think about the sample size in their pilot trials. As the quote that Cindy Billingham said that I showed you earlier, all studies we should justify our sample size. So most methods in the literature, most methodology in the literature that focuses on sample size for pilot trials actually makes the assumption that the main objective in the pilot trial is to estimate inputs for the sample size calculation in the main trial. Now, if we just go back to the objectives that I showed you earlier, you will see that that is not the main objective in many pilot feasibility trials. So although you could go to the literature and find a lot of methodological papers saying this is how you estimate your sample size for a pilot trial, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that unless your specific objective is to estimate inputs for your sample size calculation. Okay, so what else can you do? Well, you could go to Jill Lancaster's paper. Now, I have seen in quite a few pilot feasibility trials that people justify using 30 as their sample size in their pilot trial on the basis of Jill's paper. I don't think, and Jill, I know Jill would say this because she's part of our group, I don't think that's exactly what she meant when she wrote the paper, but that's how it's been interpreted. So I would say don't do that either. So what are you going to do? Well, it's not that difficult, really, that you should base your sample size on what your main objective is. Now, that means maybe sorting through your objectives and saying, you know, what's my key objective here, or what are the couple of key objectives? Let's make the study large enough in order to answer my key objective. So if the main objective is to estimate a proportion, and it very often is in these studies, so the proportion of those recruited, retained, the bounce percentage, as we saw earlier, very often it's to estimate a proportion. Then you could try choosing a sample size that will give you a certain precision around that proportion. There's a little bit of a problem in that, is that often if you do that, you will find that you're going to need a much larger sample size than you can possibly use in your study. So I would say try that, but we also have to be practical here, and very often the sample size for these studies are based on logistic factors as well as the scientific factors. But if your main objective is something like assessing the acceptability of the intervention, then you may want to think, well, what are the different types of patients, or if you're doing a cluster randomised trial, the different types of clusters that I'm going to, and you might want to draw on the kind of qualitative research idea of using purposive sample. Let's go to enough of different types of patients in order that we can say something about acceptability amongst the different types of patients or different types of clusters. Okay, key message 3. A pilot study is not about hypothesis testing, and it's not really about quantifying effectiveness. Now, the reason it's not about hypothesis testing for effectiveness, I've already talked a little bit about when I was talking about sample size calculations. If you're going to do any sort of hypothesis test, then really your study should be powered adequately for that hypothesis test. And we don't want to power adequately for the hypothesis testing about effectiveness in this study, because it would then make it a main trial, and we are doing a pilot trial. So the analysis definitely, although I'm a statistician, I would say definitely doesn't need to be statistical in these studies. We don't want any hypothesis testing. If your objective is to estimate some percentages, then simply estimate the percentages. Do put confidence intervals around them. That's always good practice. But it may not need anything further than that. And qualitative work needs to be described and the results reported appropriately if you're doing qualitative work within your study. That may mean that you need to have a web supplement for any qualitative work within the pilot trial if you're reporting it within the pilot trial, but you can also report it separately. But there is a tendency within these studies for any qualitative work to be reported very minimally, and we would say make sure that your qualitative work is described properly. So if we look back to the example I've already given you, most of the things that this study were looking at, acceptability, demand and practicability, could be estimated just with proportions, and that's exactly what they did in this study. So key message 4 that a pilot trial is about making a decision about whether to proceed with the next stage. And the next stage may be the main trial, or it may be another feasibility study. But that's what you're trying to decide with your pilot or feasibility study. What am I going to do next? What's it going to look like? How am I going to make those decisions? Shall I go on and do the main trial, or do I need to go back and do some more piloting work? So here is a lovely example from LeBlanc et al. In 2011. A trial looking at the optimal use of antibiotics, and the intervention was education in shared decision-making among family physicians and patients. So the objective of the pilot trial was to assess the feasibility and acceptability of the study design, the procedures, and the intervention. And these investigators put together a nice long list, I'm not sure I've got all of them here, of pre-specified criteria for judging whether to proceed to the main trial. So they were recruiting family medicine groups, and they wanted over half of those to participate. They were recruiting physicians to workshops, training workshops, and they wanted more than 70% of those to participate in the workshops. They wanted them to be very satisfied with the workshops, and they wanted a minimal amount of missing data. So those were their criteria. Okay, so what actually happened in this study? What they found was that only 24% of family medicine groups agreed to participate, not the 50% that they wanted. So what they said was this: not reaching the pre-established criteria does not necessarily indicate unfeasibility of the trial, but rather underlines changes to be made to the protocol. Okay, so we agree with them. We're not quite sure that they thought about this before they started the study, but we do agree with their conclusions. And it's becoming common now, when doing these types of studies, to not think about criteria in terms of one cut-off point, but to think about a sort of traffic light system. Above this percentage, we'll definitely go ahead. Within this range, we'll have to make some changes. And below this point, we won't go ahead. So rather than just one cut-off, 2 cut-off points are useful. So this is an example of a more recent study where they've got implications for progression from the pilot to the future definitive trial. And they explain that 6 homes declined to actively participate. And so to ensure cooperation with that and with the entire team in the home, they made some changes within their protocol. Okay, so those are really the 4 key messages that come out of the work that we've done and are in the CONSORT statement, so you can read more, the CONSORT extension, so you can read more about that. So just to give you a little flavour of this CONSORT extension, what have we done to the CONSORT to extend it to pilot trials? We've added one item about ethics. We have 40 sub-items within those items. 14 are unchanged, 21 are adapted, and 5 are new. And we've removed 2 sub-items which are specifically related to measuring effectiveness. The new sub-items are about how participants are identified and consented, because I think it's particularly important in something addressing feasibility that we know within the feasibility study about those higher stage processes, what happens right at the beginning, how people were identified. That helps others who are reading the study. We've added this item about pre-specified criteria. We've added other important intended consequences, as I mentioned earlier. If something pops up in the pilot study that you weren't expecting, but it makes you change what you're going to do, then that needs reporting. And then not only do the pre-specified criteria for progression need reporting, but it needs to be reported clearly how this study has helped in thinking about the progression from the pilot to the future definitive trial. And then the last new item, as I said, is about ethical approval. We've adapted the sub-items. Many are minor. We've just added the word pilot to them. But in the introduction, we've stated that we would like people to put in a scientific background for the main trial and a rationale for the pilot. Why are you doing a pilot at this stage? We've removed the word hypotheses. We've changed the sample size to say rationale for numbers in the pilot trial rather than to talk about a sample size calculation. We've changed the item on subgroup analysis to talk about these other analyses performed that you might not have decided at the beginning, but that you might do as part of the study because something occurs to you as you're going along. And we've emphasised that the reporting should apply to objectives and assessments and measurements. We've taken out the word outcomes out of several items. And in the discussion, we've added changed three items to make them more applicable to pilot trials. So, conclusions regarding the conduct of pilot trials. Base your objectives on uncertainties, list specific objectives. What you do within the study should follow the objectives. Think about how you're going to make that decision to progress, and fully report aspects of the trial which will help others, particularly what the pilot has made you change. So here's the bit of uncertainty in my talk, is that I think that, this extension was due to be published jointly between the BMJ and the new Pilot Feasibilities Journal on Friday. I can see some evidence that it's been published in Pilot Feasibility Studies. At the moment, there's a blank there because I can't see the evidence that it's been published in the BMJ. But if it wasn't on Friday, maybe it will be today. But it's imminently hot off the press. What about feasibility studies that are not randomised pilot studies? We're hoping to write some guidance on this as well, but I think some of the things that I've already talked about apply to these studies as well. So finally, just thinking about the key to planning. So this is the kind of conversation that I would expect with people who are planning a main RCT and thinking about feasibility work. Will you be able to do, this is me talking to them perhaps, will you be able to do this? Or them asking, will we be able to do this? The answer, I don't know. If the answer is I don't know, why don't you know? What is it that is making you uncertain about this? And if there is some uncertainty there, well, let's find out whether we can actually do this. How do we do that? Well, we do that via a feasibility study and particular features of a feasibility study. If you want to read a little bit more about decision making, there's a paper describing the ADEPT process for decision making after pilot feasibility trials published in 2013. And another paper also published in 2013 by Charlesworth, just thinking about that whole process of decision making at the end of your pilot feasibility study. There is this new journal, I perhaps should take off the word new now because it's been around a little while, where you can actually get your pilot feasibility studies published, and the editors understand about pilot feasibility studies. And so I wanted to leave you with a nice African proverb, a contribution of one of our group. You never test the depth of a river with both feet. Let's just dip a toe in or put one foot in first before we decide to go ahead. And hopefully if you do that, you will end up in this position when you do your main study, which is, I think, what feasibility work is all about. Thank you very much.